Is Singapore truly the world's most perfect city? Or is it a flawless mask hiding cracks that no one is allowed to talk about? You have seen the skyline. You have seen the spotless streets, the gleaming airports, the world rankings that put Singapore at the top of almost every list imaginable. First in safety, first in efficiency, first in quality of life. But here is the question that critics, journalists, and economists around the world have been quietly asking in 2026. What is the real price of all that perfection? Singapore is a city-state that feels almost too good to be true. And when something feels too good to be true, it usually is, at least partially. Behind the Marina Bay lights and the immaculate public transport system, there are voices raising serious concerns. Voices from academics, human rights organizations, foreign correspondents, and even everyday Singaporeans who feel the weight of a system that demands so much and allows so little room for disagreement. This is not an attack on Singapore. This is a mirror. Because the truth, as critics see it, is far more complex than any tourist brochure will ever tell you. Let us go through it, one point at a time.
Point 1. Freedom of speech and press censorship. Let us start with the one thing that critics bring up almost every single time Singapore is discussed: the near total control over what can be said, published, and broadcast in this country. In 2026, Singapore still ranks dangerously low on global press freedom indexes. Reporters Without Borders consistently places it outside the top 100 countries for press freedom, a staggering figure for a nation that ranks first in almost everything else. The government holds indirect ownership stakes in major local media outlets. Laws like the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, commonly known as POFMA, give authorities the power to label any online content as false and demand its removal or correction. Critics argue this law is weaponized against opposition voices and independent journalism, rather than actual misinformation. Journalists who challenge the ruling party or report unfavorably on government policies have faced lawsuits, forced retractions, and in some cases, financial ruin. The message is clear: report carefully or pay the price. For a country that calls itself a democracy, that silence is deafening.
Point 2. Political opposition is structurally suppressed. Singapore has been ruled by the same political party, the People's Action Party, since independence in 1965. That is over 60 years of unbroken one-party dominance. Critics say this is not simply because the party is popular, it is because the system is deliberately designed to make opposition nearly impossible. Electoral boundaries are redrawn before almost every election in a process that critics call gerrymandering. Group representation constituencies bundle multiple seats together, making it harder for smaller opposition parties to break through. Legal actions, including defamation lawsuits, have historically been used against opposition politicians, draining them of time, money, and public credibility. In the 2025 general election, the People's Action Party once again secured a commanding majority. The Workers' Party, the only credible opposition force, held a small cluster of seats, impressive by Singapore standards, but still a fraction of parliament. Critics argue that without genuine political competition, accountability is a performance rather than a reality. Power without challenge, they say, is the beginning of every authoritarian story.
Point 3. Cost of living has become crushing. For years, Singapore wore its high cost of living as a badge of honor, proof of its world-class status. But in 2026, critics are asking who exactly gets to live that world-class life and who is simply surviving it. Singapore is consistently ranked among the top 3 most expensive cities on the planet. The average price of a private apartment in districts like Orchard or Marina Bay runs into the millions.
even a modest housing development board flat, the public housing that most Singaporeans live in, has crossed the $1 million mark in popular areas. Food, transport, and childcare costs have all climbed steadily. Inflation over the past 3 years has hit working-class and lower-middle-class families particularly hard. Foreign workers, who make up a significant portion of the labor force, often live in dormitories in conditions that drew international attention during the COVID-19 pandemic. Critics argue that Singapore's economic miracle has increasingly become a miracle for the wealthy and the globally mobile, while ordinary residents tread water just to stay afloat. The gap between those who thrive here and those who merely endure it, they say, is growing wider every single year.
Point 4. LGBT rights remain deeply restricted. In 2022, Singapore took a step that made global headlines. It repealed Section 377A of the Penal Code, which had criminalized sex between men. The world celebrated. But critics say the celebration was premature and dangerously misleading. At almost the same moment the repeal was announced, the government moved to amend the Constitution to protect the existing legal definition of marriage, explicitly between a man and a woman, and to prevent any future court challenge to that definition. In other words, one door was opened while another was permanently locked. In 2026, same-sex couples in Singapore still cannot marry, adopt children, or access the same housing and financial benefits available to heterosexual couples. Public expressions of same-sex affection remain culturally policed, even if not always legally prosecuted. LGBT content in media, advertising, and public spaces continues to face restrictions. Human rights organizations describe Singapore's approach as carefully managed tolerance, enough to soften international criticism, not enough to change the lived reality for LGBT Singaporeans. The optics improved. The equality, critics say, did not.
Point 5. Foreign worker treatment raises ethical alarms. Singapore's skyline was built, quite literally, by migrant workers. The roads, the terminals, the luxury condominiums, all of it constructed by hundreds of thousands of workers, mostly from Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar, who live and work under conditions that critics describe as a parallel, invisible Singapore. These workers live in large dormitories, often housing tens of thousands of men in close quarters. During the COVID-19 pandemic, these dormitories became outbreak epicenters, revealing to the world the conditions that had long been documented by advocacy groups, but largely ignored by mainstream conversation. In 2026, reforms have been introduced. Dormitory standards have improved on paper, but critics point out that structural vulnerabilities remain. Workers are tied to their employers through work permit systems that limit their ability to change jobs or leave without financial penalty. Wage theft and contract manipulation are still reported regularly by labor rights organizations. The workers who build Singapore's luxury cannot afford to live in it. And the system, critics argue, is specifically designed to keep it that way, extracting maximum labor while maintaining minimum accountability. That is not a labor policy. That is a hierarchy with a legal framework around it.
Point 6. Surveillance and social control are pervasive. Singapore has one of the highest densities of closed-circuit cameras per capita in the entire world. The government does not hide this. In fact, it promotes it as a feature, not a flaw. Safety, they say, comes from visibility. Critics say it comes with a cost that goes far beyond comfort. In 2026, Singapore's surveillance infrastructure has expanded significantly into digital spaces. The country operates one of the most sophisticated national digital identity systems in the world, SingPass, which links citizens to healthcare, tax, housing, employment, and government services through a single platform. Convenient, yes, but critics point out that this centralization creates enormous state visibility into everyday life.
Smart lampposts equipped with sensors, facial recognition capabilities, and data collection tools have been deployed across the city. Civil liberties advocates argue that Singapore is quietly becoming one of the most surveilled societies on Earth, with almost no public debate about the boundaries of acceptable monitoring. The government frames all of this as safety and efficiency. Critics frame it as the infrastructure of control. The line between the two, they argue, is a question Singapore has never been truly allowed to debate openly.
Point 7. Mental health crisis is growing in silence. Beneath Singapore's culture of achievement, the top grades, the top universities, there is a growing and largely unspoken mental health crisis. Critics and mental health professionals have been raising the alarm for years, but in a society that equates visible struggle with personal failure, the silence has been louder than the conversation. Singapore students face some of the most intense academic pressure in the world. The primary school leaving examination, taken at around 11 or 12 years old, plays a significant role in determining a child's educational trajectory for the rest of their life. Tuition spending by families runs into the billions of dollars annually. The pressure to perform begins before a child can fully understand what performance means. Adult burnout rates are high. Singapore ranks among the most overworked populations in Asia. A 2025 survey found that a significant percentage of workers reported chronic stress, sleep deprivation, and anxiety, yet fewer than half had sought professional help. Critics argue that Singapore's mental health infrastructure is underfunded relative to the scale of the problem, and that the cultural stigma around mental illness is inseparable from the country's performance-obsessed identity. You cannot fix a wound you are not allowed to name.
Point 8. Death penalty usage draws global condemnation. Singapore executes people regularly and overwhelmingly for drug offenses. In a country known for rule of law and efficiency, the continued use of the mandatory death penalty has made it one of the most criticized governments in the world on this specific issue. In 2026, Singapore remains one of the highest per capita executioners globally. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have repeatedly condemned the practice. The mandatory nature of the sentence, meaning judges have little discretion once certain drug thresholds are crossed, is particularly controversial. Critics argue that the vast majority of those executed are low-level drug couriers, often from disadvantaged backgrounds, who were recruited as mules by far larger criminal networks. The kingpins rarely face the rope. The vulnerable often do. The government defends the policy as a powerful deterrent that has kept Singapore largely drug-free compared to its neighbors. Critics counter that the evidence for deterrence is weak, that irreversible punishment for nonviolent offenses is a human rights violation by definition, and that no amount of cleanliness justifies state-sanctioned death as a tool of social order. The debate, in Singapore itself, is barely permitted to exist.
Point 9. Meritocracy masks deep inequality. Singapore's founding mythology is built on meritocracy, the idea that talent, hard work, and determination are the only true gatekeepers of success. It is a beautiful idea. Critics say it is also a convenient one, because it absolves the system of responsibility for those who fall behind. In practice, meritocracy in Singapore is shaped profoundly by class. Families who can afford enrichment classes, private tutors, international schools, and overseas university education give their children advantages that no amount of individual effort can overcome without access to resources. The race is called fair, but not everyone starts at the same line. Ethnic minorities, particularly Malays and Indians, continue to report systemic disadvantages in housing, employment, and social mobility. Studies and surveys conducted within Singapore itself have documented significant levels of racial discrimination in job hiring and rental markets. The government's response has traditionally been to point to successful examples of minority achievement and to treat structural racism as a problem of individual attitude rather than systemic design. Critics say this is exactly what meritocracy mythology does best. It makes inequality look like a personal failing. In 2026, that myth is fraying faster than the government would like to admit.
Point 10. The model is not exportable and may not even be sustainable. The final and perhaps most profound critique of Singapore in 2026 is this. The Singapore model only works because of a very specific set of conditions that cannot be replicated elsewhere and may not even last here. Singapore is a city-state of roughly 6 million people with no rural hinterland, no agricultural economy, and no federal complexity. It sits at one of the world's most strategically valuable trade choke points. It built its wealth during a unique window of globalization, low-cost manufacturing migration, and Western investment that no longer exists in the same form. Critics argue that the authoritarian bargain, surrender freedoms, receive prosperity, is becoming harder to sell to younger Singaporeans who have never known scarcity. A generation that grew up wealthy and educated is increasingly asking why it cannot also be free. The aging population, declining birth rate despite decades of government incentives, and rising reliance on foreign labor and foreign talent all point to structural pressures building beneath the surface. Singapore works, for now, under specific conditions and specific costs, but the 21st century is changing those conditions fast. Whether the model bends or breaks, critics say, is the defining question of Singapore's next chapter.
So here we are. 10 points. 10 truths that the glossy travel features and the global rankings do not put on the cover. None of this means Singapore is a failure. Far from it. By almost every measurable standard, it is one of the most extraordinary governance experiments in modern history. 60 years ago, it was a swampy port with almost no natural resources. Today, it is a global financial hub, a medical center, a technology powerhouse, and yes, still one of the cleanest and safest cities on Earth. But extraordinary achievements do not deserve immunity from scrutiny. And the critics who raise these concerns are not enemies of Singapore. Many of them are Singaporeans themselves, academics, lawyers, artists, and ordinary citizens who love their country enough to demand that it be better than what it currently allows itself to be. The most honest measure of a society is not what it builds. It is what it permits its people to say about what it builds. By that measure, Singapore still has a long road ahead. If this script opened your eyes to something you had not considered before, share it. Because conversations that are difficult to have are usually the ones most worth having. Thank you for watching.